This is a presentation that explains how I see the app being developed for the DEIMP project, and it starts with what I believe will be the core part of the app, and that is a database of video activities or scenarios that have been identified as particularly innovative, possibly disruptive, and are intended to inspire teachers to show them what is possible and what they might aspire to do using mobile technologies. And alongside that would be the database of apps which are linked to pedagogical uses based on the IPAC framework. And again, that would be a core element of the app, because in order to undertake the activities, they're going to need to use particular apps. But if we can go back to the start and think about what the app might look like from a perspective of a user, I imagine we would start with a sign-in screen, and I think we will need that in order to collect data about who's downloaded the app, how often the app's been used. But at this stage, that data is probably anonymised, therefore it prevents teachers who may be afraid or deterred from using the app because they've given personal data. And the first question which the app addresses is, how am I currently using mobile technologies, or how could I use them in my teaching? So this app could be for teachers who've already used some mobile technologies but feel they can do more, or it could be for new teachers, pre-service teachers for example, who have never used mobile technologies. And the first element of the app would be a survey or a needs analysis. I imagine we'll use the existing IPAC task survey, although it may need modifying. There are currently two versions of this survey. One is related to a particular task that you might have undertaken, and the other one is generic, and it's asking you to just evaluate your use of mobile technologies in a general context. So that's what we would ask people to do as the first activity, and either survey produces this kind of polar chart feedback. It's a graph, it can be shown in different formats, and it identifies the areas that the user is strong in based on the IPAC framework, and those areas that need further development. There are in fact two versions of this, because you can, if you wish as a teacher, ask your students to complete the survey, in which case it would show the results side by side. Either way, it leads to a report, and that report would identify what areas the user is particularly strong in terms of using mobile technologies, and areas they might want to develop in order to use mobiles more innovatively. And this brings us back to the central core of the app, the database of video scenarios, which we will create based on the scoping study that we're currently undertaking, and also a database of apps. And together these can be used as a source of inspiration, to give teachers ideas about how they might want to teach. And we imagine that for the database of scenarios, there would be opportunities at this point for the user to evaluate them in terms of how far they think they are innovative, disruptive, how interesting they think they are. In other words, to build up some feedback from users so that the database becomes dynamic. Now, for some users, that might be as far as they go. They may never actually use any of these, they may look at the scenarios, but they don't actually use them. However, we hope that some users will go further and will wish to actually design their own activity or mobile learning scenario using our examples as inspiration. So there we've got this question. Now, at this point, we imagine there will be a kind of cut-off point, point of further registration, because from this point onwards it's required, or the user would be required, to undertake some activity that has to be recorded. They need to provide additional information to us, and they also need to record what they're doing in order to develop another activity of their own. So we see this partly as a research database, so we will collect data from this point onwards, and we'd need to make sure that we had permission, ethical permissions and so on. So at this point there would be a further registration, people giving us permission to use the data that they collect, and also people accepting that they'll have to undertake more activity in order to move any further forwards. I think it's probably likely that we'll need to think of incentives as well at this point to encourage people to go beyond this point. So at this point, people are asking the question, how will I evaluate the impact of this new strategy? That's what this second half of the app is all about, and there are a number of elements. These are not in any particular order, but we imagine at this point, for example, we would collect more demographic data about the user, who they are they a teacher, what subject, what phase, perhaps even personal data if we want to interview them, email address, and so on. We would need to include some resources at this point which gave the user more advice and guidance on how to adapt and transfer the examples they've seen in the database into their own practice. So these might be information sheets or additional video tutorials. We would want the user to give us some data or feedback on the context that they're creating their activity for. So for example, what age group, where do they teach, what kind of scenario, is it indoors, outdoors, informal, and so on. And I think we'd also want to collect from the feedback from the user feedback on what they actually did, to give us some idea of what activities they undertook, how they created the scenario, and what use it had. And of course that links in as well with data they might have collected. So they might be on a field trip, they might at this point collect live data, images of students undertaking activities using the app that they've chosen. Ultimately, we want to collect some impact data, and this would be instruments that would collect data from the user about the impact of the scenario they've created. That will also provide us with impact data about the app as a whole. And then we'd probably ask them to complete the rubric evaluation about the app that they've chosen, because that will feed back into the database, which you can see on the left hand side. That will create more data in the database, and that will encourage more people to use the database of apps because there'll be more recommendations. Then finally, if they're willing to, we'd really like them to create their own video scenario based on their activity that they put back into the database. And this becomes a virtuous circle. This is why the whole thing is iterative. If we can encourage them to add their own examples, then the database will grow. Now, just to give you an idea of how I see some of the elements within the database itself, this is an example, for example, of an innovation scale. And it would allow users to rank the particular activity they've watched according to scales such as how innovative it is. This is just an idea, it's not fixed in stone or anything, but we might want to get an idea from users about the extent to which they think a particular scenario is innovative or disruptive. So that gives you an overview of the different stages that we're thinking about at the moment in terms of the app's development. These are just ideas, and I'd like to use them as a starting point for discussion when we next meet online, but also as the basis of the meeting that we'll be organising in Cyprus, where I think we need to turn a lot of these ideas into concrete proposals and actions.